Are you as horny as you look? God, I'm horny.
Excuse me. I just remembered I have to go powder my hair.
If you're gonna keep doing that, at least pop open a window, huh?
Oh, pardon me for interrupting. Ma'am? Excuse me, have you seen a historian around here? Never mind. All right, Jones. How are you going to find the Space Quest historian and all this junk? Oh no. Ow! Ooh, ouch! Oh, my back. Hey, Space Quest historian! Space Quest historian, I presume. I'm here to rescue you. Let's get you out of here before the guards show up.
Rescue me? Why?
You don't need rescue or anything.
Oh, fuck no. Whatever gave you that idea?
People heard screaming, and you're tied to a chair.
Yes, and your point is?
Isn't there something you need help with?
Oh, can I borrow your whip, by the way? I think that might come in handy.
What? No. Look, I'm sorry. I don't... What exactly is this anyway?
I'm afraid that's a private matter.
How so?
Well?
Here we are, Space Quest historian. 100 beats! Ah, Dr. Jones, will you be joining us? I can always fetch more. Beats!
Ugh, not a chance. I am out of here. This is weirder than a Sierra adventure game.
I am the Space Quest historian. In the early 1990s, LucasArts could seemingly do no wrong. From the release of The Secret of Monkey Island onwards, pretty much every game they put out, in the point-and-click adventure game genre at least, were certified bangers, both in the eyes of critics and players alike. There's a reason why LucasArts games are regarded by the general adventure game-playing public these days as timeless, forward-thinking classics that haven't aged a day, whereas the contemporary titles from Sierra, with their dogged adherence to the punishing design philosophies of text adventures, such as dead-end scenarios and often unpredictable player deaths, are viewed as archaic and quote-unquote a product of their time. And that's because LucasArts games truly were forward-thinking. A lot of the amenities we would expect from a modern-day adventure game, like not being able to get softlock because you missed an important detail early in the game, or the fact that simply poking your head into an unexplored location might get you killed and bring the game to a screeching premature halt, originated from the LucasArts design philosophy of the early 90s. And LucasArts were very much aware of this, going so far as to taking a very pointed stab at Sierra's insistence on brutal game design in their manuals. Yes, manuals, plural. This paragraph about not being able to die or get irrevocably stuck was reprinted in every single game they put out. They really wanted you to know that they were there to entertain you first and foremost, not punish you, and they knew damn well that this is what set them apart from not just Sierra games, but the expected norm of adventure games from that period. But this came at the cost of their games being perceived at the time as too easy. Believe it or not, a lot of adventure game players of the time expected to be treated roughly, like playing a game was part pastime, part assume the position and let's get lubed up. Loom, in particular, one of LucasArts' early masterpieces and easily one of my favorite games of all time, got absolutely reamed by reviewers at the time for being so easy it might as well have been a children's game. Don't worry, we're getting to Fate of Atlantis in just a bit, but we gotta throw in a bit more historical context. It's also important to note that LucasArts didn't just wiggle their way out of the digital womb with a fully grown design philosophy dangling between their little leggies. Two of their earliest successes in the late 80s, Maniac Mansion, the game that arguably invented the modern point-and-click game as we know it today, and the less fondly remembered but still pretty banging fever dream of a game Zack McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders, did indeed have the elements of game design that the company would later take a strong and very vocal stand against. Both of these games had player death, and it was indeed possible to get yourself stuck in an unwinnable state, so it's honestly kind of amusing that when LucasArts released Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis in 1992, they backpedaled on their principles. Not all of them. You can't get stuck in a dead indie walking scenario, but Indiana Jones can actually die in this game. Now, I know what you're gonna say. Yes, the movie tie-in game for The Last Crusade in 1989 also had player death, but that one actually came out before Monkey Island. Fate of Atlantis, however, came out after Monkey Island 1 and 2, well after the company's defiant stance against bullshit design had been thoroughly solidified. It is also the only game in their golden age of adventure game greatness to have player death. Later down the line, we'd see classics like Day of the Tentacle, Sam & Max Hit the Road, Full Throttle, and everyone's favorite Monkey Island fan game, Curse, all adhering strictly to the no dying, no dead ends credo. So it's actually kind of a big deal to have a LucasArts game where you're not safe from dying. Not only that, but another thing that isn't brought up very often is that this game also has a point system. Now, points are another thing usually associated with Sierra games. If you do something that advances the game, like solving a puzzle or picking up a useful item, you're awarded points. Most Sierra games have a max score that is only achievable by doing everything you're supposed to do and then some, kind of like a precursor to achievement hunting. And Fate of Atlantis does the same thing as did The Last Crusade. They call it the Indie Quotient. Yes, the acronym is IQ. But it functions exactly like the point system in Sierra games, and this is also something that was exclusive to the Indiana Jones games. No other LucasArts adventure game does this. The reason why it's almost never brought up is probably because it's so well hidden in the game itself. To see how many points you have to press the I button on your keyboard, which will then replace the inventory portion of the UI at the bottom with a status bar showing your current amount of points and the total. Oh, and it also shows you what path you're on. Yeah, let's talk about the paths. By far the most impressive part of Fate of Atlantis is its replay value. Early on, the story will branch off into 3 separate paths, and the game will play out almost entirely different based on what path you've chosen, until it all comes together at the end just in time for the final stretch and the end credits. Now, you don't need me to give you a recap of the story in Fate of Atlantis. I'm sure everyone watching this has played it or are at least familiar with it because, not only is it one of the most beloved classics of an era filled with classic adventure games, but it also stars fucking Indiana Jones. But the branching path thing is, to me at least, so brilliant and so well executed, it's almost like you're getting 3 games for the price of 1. And that's why I'm going to be spending the vast majority of this video talking about it. And you can't really do that without getting into details of the story, so strap yourselves in, and yeah, there's your spoiler warning, kids, as if you needed one. The game is set in 1939, so in the official indie timeline, this takes place after the first 3 movies. Some might say the only movies of the franchise, but I'm not gonna go there. The Second World War, the sequel that literally no one asked for, is about to pop off in a big way, and the Nazis are looking for anything and everything that will give them the upper hand. So there's Indy, chilling out on his home turf at Barnett College, looking for an ancient artifact at the behest of the not at all suspicious Mr. Smith, a dude with a German accent so thick and a demeanor so sus that he might as well be wearing a big neon sign strapped to his forehead that says Nazi spy.
What is Fritz?
Well, there he goes. Turns out Mr. Smith is actually Klaus Kerner, a card-carrying goose stepper who answers to this dude.
Dr. Uberman. Kerner, at last!
And yes, he sounds exactly like Dr. Fred from Day of the Tentacle.
It's a dark day for mad science.
And that's because it's the same actor, Nick Jameson, doing both of them, and he apparently only has one mad scientist voice in his repertoire. Still, he went on to voice Max in Sam & Max Hit the Road, and that voice is still the only voice I will accept for that character. Everyone else pales in comparison.
Gratuitous acts of senseless violence are my forte.
Classic. Anyway, German Dr. Fred here wanted this thing because it's actually an artifact from the lost civilization of Atlantis. Yes, the city that couldn't swim, Atlantis. And if you feed it a special metal bead known as orichalcum, it does this fantastic party trick.
Bye, have a great time.
Which he somehow thinks could be used to make bombs or something.
Think big like the American. Think of bomb.
Not sure how that will work, but he's the scientist here, so what do I know? Anyway, the only problem with that plan is that these orichalcum beads are in pretty short supply, given that they also originate from Atlantis, which means that now they'll also have to find the lost city itself in order to get enough beads to power up their bombs or whatever.
Bomb.
So, long story short, it's now a race between Indy and the Nazis to find Atlantis before, you know the drill. Along for the ride, or at least part of it, depending on what path you choose, more on that later, is Sophia Hapgood, a former colleague of Indy who gave up archaeology to become a psychic fraud who travels around the country giving marathon lectures about Atlantis to roomfuls of gullible idiots and pretending to be guided by the spirit of a dead Atlantean king named Nur-Apsal who lives in her necklace. Yeah, you heard me. She's actually not as cuckoo as you might think because, as it turns out, spoiler, Atlantis is real and the spirit of Nur-Apsal is indeed living inside of her necklace because it wouldn't be an Indiana Jones story without the most ludicrous mythological bullshit somehow turning out to be real, but we'll get to all of that later. Anyway, once Indy tracks down Sophia and gets her to tag along with him, they do a little bit of tag teaming in order to find the Lost Dialogue of Plato, a mythical tome that supposedly details the location of Atlantis, which of course also turns out to be real, and from this point on, you're now given the choice of which path you want the story to take. There are 3 paths through the game: wits, fists, and team. The team path is the one most first-time players choose because it's the most obvious one. Sophia asks whether she should tag along with Indy for the rest of the adventure, and the obvious choice is to say yes because that's what the story has been leading up to so far. And it is also arguably the easiest and the most LucasArtsy path, so it is definitely also the path the developers want you to take the first time around. The other choices, at first glance, seem like red herrings. You can tell Sophia that you'd rather go alone, but the obvious assumption is that Sophia would simply tell Indy to go fuck himself and tag along anyway. Wrong. This may look like a standard LucasArts conversation inside a standard LucasArts dialogue tree where you can choose to say anything you want and it won't have any significant repercussions or impact on the story, but this one is different. Very different. What you choose right here at this particular junction in the conversation essentially determines what kind of game you're going to be playing for the next 2/3 of the game. And something that most people don't pick up on is that Sophia will actually recommend what path you should choose depending on how you solved an earlier puzzle. This puzzle, where you have to get past the bouncer at a New York theater, actually has 3 solutions, and Sophia's recommendation is determined by which solution you pick. You can either choose to smooth talk your way past this burly fuck, which again is probably what most first-time players would do, and this makes Sophia recommend going together on the team path because you obviously seem to enjoy a good dialogue puzzle. Alternatively, you can just slam his fucking teeth in, which obviously is going to get your recommendation for the fists path, wherein most of the game can be solved by simply getting in a bunch of fist fights. And then there's a sneaky approach, which is to move these crates out of the way and jump through the open window, meaning you don't have to deal with the gorilla at all, and this counts as the sort of unparalleled ingenuity that will earn you a recommendation for the wits path, which is essentially the game on hard mode, where Indy goes alone and the solutions to the puzzles are a bit more difficult than you'd expect from your standard LucasArts affair. Most of the locations you'll visit during the game will be the same, but what you'll actually be doing there for the most part will be vastly different, and some characters will even have vastly different personalities. Take Omar Al-Jabbar here. You need a map from this guy that will take you to a dig site in the desert. On the team path, all you have to do is show him the Sunstone, an Atlantean artifact that we will absolutely get back to later. On the fists path, you find him at his house being held at gunpoint by a Nazi goon. But on the wits path, he's not just a total dig, but also in with the Nazis, and you have to lock the cheeky fucker in his own closet in order to get the map. Meanwhile, this snooty fuck, Alan Trottier, remains identically snooty and fucky no matter what path you're on, but the way you interact interact with him is wildly different. On Fists, he simply gives you a business card and fucks off into the night. On the other two paths, he has the Sunstone. Yes, I will get back to these fucking stones, mark my words, but the way you get it off of him is radically different. On the team path, you have to go through a lengthy seance sequence that involves Indy dressing up as an unconvincing ghost and spooking the shit out of him. There is also an alternate solution that just involves talking him into handing it over, but that's obviously not as much fun. Bizarrely though, the Wits path has you doing a high-speed chase through the streets of Monte Carlo because this little twerp started waving his rare irreplaceable artifact around in the air and promptly getting kidnapped by Nazis. Once you've rammed their car a few times, causing it to crash, the fucking imbecile then says he tossed the stone out of the window during the chase. Way to handle priceless antiques there, turd brain. And now it's up to Indy to find out where it landed by walking up and down the streets looking at street signs in what is possibly the most tedious puzzle of the entire game. It's so bizarre because the last thing you'd expect from a big brain path is an arcade sequence where you ram a car off the road, and conversely, the last thing you'd expect from the Fists path is to have to do this excavation dig puzzle on Crete that's a close second for the most tedious puzzle of the entire game. This puzzle is also on the team path, but at least you've got Sophia to help you out there.
Yoo-hoo!
I know it's not like the Fists path is supposed to turn this thing into an arcade game because, quick side note, there actually was an arcade game based on the story released concurrently with this game, cleverly titled Fate of Atlantis the Arcade Game, and it is complete and utter dog shit. But this excavation thing where you have to triangulate the location of the place where you're supposed to get the Moonstone is one of the most difficult ones in the game, so it's really weird to have to do this on a path that's supposed to be the me not a thinker, me a pummeler path. Yeah, I really should talk about these fucking stones now, shouldn't I? The Sunstone, the Moonstone, and the Worldstone. Hi guys, how you doing? You can get absolutely fucked, you know that? Every time you want to get somewhere that takes you closer to Atlantis, you have to plop these things onto a spindle and spin them around until they click into place using the cryptic hints given in the Lost Dialogue, which incidentally is also a priceless and irreplaceable artifact that Indy decided to just carry around with him the whole time. For an archaeologist, he sure isn't terribly concerned with preservation, but anyway, the problem with these things isn't that the puzzle is particularly hard to figure out. The hints in the Lost Dialogue can be a little tricky to parse, but it's not like completely off-the-wall moon logic bullshit. Now, the problem is you have to do this puzzle 4 fucking times. No, sorry, 5 fucking times. I forgot about the one at the end in the Atlantean room. 5. And the solution each time is random, meaning you can't just write down or memorize the answers the first time you play and then cheese them for every subsequent play. No, you have to sift through this fucking book and twirl these fucking stones around in new and unpredictable configurations every time you play this game. And I know that doesn't sound so bad, and in fairness, it probably isn't. I can think of a lot of other puzzles in other games that are far worse and should rightfully consign the designer to an eternity of burning in hell, but I am talking about a game here that is nearly flawless in every respect, from the story to the game design to the presentation itself. So if I'm gonna nitpick something I really hate about this game, it's gonna be these fucking stone discs. Or the fighting. The fighting really sucks. I mean, it's not like you could have an Indiana Jones game without the dude handing out a knuckle sandwich or two, and of course you shouldn't expect Mortal Kombat levels of intricate fighting mechanics in a point-and-click adventure game from the early 90s, but I've been playing this game ever since it came out in 1992, and now, almost 35 years later, I still haven't figured out how this shit's supposed to work. Now, I will totally cop to this being a skill issue, because I've seen people absolutely demolish in this game. I mean, there are 2 opponents that are supposed to be unstoppable. There's this tanky fuck Arnold, who you come across on the Fists path in the catacombs, and he's an absolute knuckle sponge. And then there's this one a bit later when you reach Atlantis, who doesn't look like he's going to be any more of a threat than any of the scores of Nazi goons you square off during the course of the game. But surprise, motherfucker, this guy turns out to be an Olympic boxing champion, and this guy is by far the hardest of all of them, to the point where you have next to 0 chance of taking him down unless you grind this fight over and over again and just pray you get a lucky round. But I've seen people actually do it, so I know there's actual skill involved, but I just do not possess the skill, and no matter how many times I've legitimately hunkered down and tried to get my brains around this, I just can't do it. I think it's because it's one of those things that looks like it should be easy enough, but it is surprisingly complicated, and the learning curve is just off the fucking charts. You can throw a punch in 3 directions: face, chest, and babymaker, and you can also block these directions from when your opponent throws punches at you. There's a power meter that determines how hard you hit, and if you just spam the punch button, it depletes to the point where you're just lightly tapping the enemy instead of caving their faces in, so you're actively encouraged to back off, take your time, let it recharge, and then come back swinging. But the blocking is what trips me up every time. You're supposed to watch your opponent's hands to figure out which direction to block, because if you block the wrong body part, obviously your block will fail and their punch will connect. But we're talking chunky 320x200 VGA graphics and a fairly short reaction time, and my addled 45-year-old brain just cannot process this. Like I said, it's totally a skill issue. But who needs to learn all that anyway when you can just sucker punch their fucking faces in and win the fight in one hit? In pretty much every fight, except for the two super tanky motherfuckers I mentioned earlier, you can press the 0 key on your numpad to just lay them out. Fight's over. Get wrecked. Sure, you won't get any IQ points for doing so, but since when have I ever given a shit about getting a max score? And as for these two tanky motherfuckers, there are alternate solutions to defeating them that don't involve getting in their faces. You can roll a boulder over Arnold, flattening his ass and making sure he'll never slap another living creature ever again. And you can drop a statue on this guy's head, accomplishing the same. So it's not like there's a difficulty spike in this little fist fight minigame. It is actually entirely optional, which makes the fist's path by far the easiest path to finish the game with. Unless you aren't a complete tool and actually play the game as intended, which I am that complete tool.
I'm a tool. I'm a tool. I'm a tool, an unbelievably annoying tool.
Anyway, there are actually a lot of mini-games in Fate of Atlantis to break up the fun and rewarding act of puzzle solving with a bit of aggravating tedium. This hot air balloon minigame where you have to fly around and land at these little nomad camps to ask for directions to the dig site is no big deal, even though landing this thing means you have to vent a shitload of gas, which makes the air balloon spin around so it looks like you're doing these comical fart circle laps around the camp you're trying to land at. That's not too bad though, as there's no real pressure to deal with. You'll never run out of helium or ballast, and there are no dangers in the sky or on land to contend with. Even the music is serene as all hell. So there's no fail state here other than falling asleep from the coma-inducing tedium. On the Fist's path, you'll be doing this on a camel's back instead, and there are roaming enemies to deal with along the way, but they're relatively easy to stay clear of, and even if you get sideswiped by one of them, it's just a regular fist fight that you can win in a single hit. Everyone always gives the submarine minigame shit, but I never found it to be much of a problem either. Sure, it's a bit hard to gauge where you are in terms of spatial relation to the camera angle since it's a pseudo 3D view instead of a side view, and the sub is pretty slow, so again, there is the risk of falling asleep at the wheel, but just as with this hot air balloon, there is no fail state to this. You don't have a time limit, you don't have any air supply or fuel to worry about, and there are no environmental dangers to worry about, so it's just a matter of piddling around in circles until you find the right exit. Less enjoyable for me are these top-down minigames, like the aforementioned car chase, or this one where you have to follow this dude in a red fez through the crowded streets because here you are on a timer and you can fail. And it's really hard to control Indy with any sort of precision because he just darts around on the screen like his ass is on fire. Not to mention that the little pixels you're supposed to chase are only slightly bigger than the millions of other pixels darting around all over the place. Yeah, I don't like these one bit. But for the most part, this game is just brilliant. The puzzles are every bit as good as you'd expect from a LucasArts game. Not too difficult, but just challenging enough to give your brain a nice little workout. Things take a slight turn off the rails when you get to Atlantis at the end of the game, and it almost veers into missed territory, especially with this gear fixing puzzle that I thought for the longest time was just trial and error until someone pointed out that there's actually a diagram in one of the rooms that spells out exactly how you're supposed to solve it, so okay, that's on me for not paying attention. But my favorite scene in this game is here in this throne room where Sophia's necklace ghost Norapsel goes, "I'm home," and decides to just possess Sophia and refuses to let her leave. It's equal parts terrifying and hilarious because it's a terrible fate to be doomed to stay forever in the ruins of a sunken city surrounded only by mummified corpses and probably starve to death, but also hilarious because you can totally leave her there and consign her to that exact fate. Fucking hell, Indy. Then again, she did keep calling him Charles. Yeah, I had to look that up. Anyway, speaking of, the voice acting in this game is also stellar. I would even say predictably stellar, since right from the start, LucasArts actually went to the trouble of hiring real voice actors instead of just using people from around the office. Now, obviously, this guy isn't Harrison Ford.
It's a particularly sharp ship rib.
but he does a damn good job, and crucially, he's not trying to do a Harrison Ford. He's doing his own thing. This is his interpretation of Indiana Jones, and that was a great choice on his part because the whole thing would have come off as pretty hokey if we would have had to listen to someone doing an impression throughout the whole game. Well, quick side note, there was actually a fan game of this game in the works, and the guy they got to do Indy's voice there was actually a pretty good impression of Harrison Ford.
Alright, Jones. How are you gonna find this statue in all this junk?
But yeah, I'm glad we got this guy.
All right, Jones, how you gonna find that statue and all this junk?
Doug Lee is his name. He's close enough that you believe he's Indiana Jones, but he's not trying to be someone he's not. Anyway, as far as powerhouse performances go, I have to highlight this guy at the stall in Algiers. I just cannot get over the way he says,
Squap on a stick.
Hang on, let's just hear that again.
Squap on a stick.
I don't know why, but that always cracks me up. That delivery is just a thing of beauty.
I'm listening.
Anyway, I think I've just managed to do my first retrospective without completely spoiling the entire story, so just for completeness sake, here we go. After finding Atlantis and getting inside by, yes you guessed it, spinning more of these fucking discs around, Indy finds the place crawling with Nazis who somehow got in here before he did, which always seemed like a plot hole to me, but maybe there were more than one way in and I just missed that detail every time I played this game for the past 34 years. Mr. Smith and Dr. Zink of Bombs are already here at the center of Atlantis, which also seems like a plot hole to me because it took a hell of a lot of work for me to get in here, so I don't know if they just found a back door or whatever, but anyway, Nazi Dr. Fred here thinks this machine in the middle of the room might turn him into a living god, which is indeed what it was supposed to do, but everyone it's ever been tried out on have been turned into disfigured monsters, so dumbfuck McGoosesteps here decides to go first and predictably gets turned into a disfigured monster.
Himmel, it's working!
Into the soup he goes. Seeing as he might need to make some further calibrations, Dr. Dipshit decides Indy would make a great subject for fine-tuning the device and orders him to step into the circle. Indy then tells him that if he's successful, the first thing he'll do as a divine entity is to smoke some Nazi ass, which convinces the good doctor to take his place instead and turn into a giant disco ball.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Which then starts wrecking the place for no readily discernible reason other than because this is an Indiana Jones story and there has to be a daring escape at the end. It's the law. Hello, Future SQH here. Just wanted to point out a little Easter egg here that I was unaware of until I started editing this video. See this animation of Uberman's transformation? It was drawn by a guy named Bill Eakin, who used to work for Sierra Online doing box covers and marketing art for 9 months before jumping ship to LucasArts, where he got to make actual in-game art, including this lovely animation. And apparently he had such a miserable time working at Sierra that he felt the need to sneak in a little middle finger to them in this game. Now, it's a little hard to make out, but apparently the ghostly apparition mouths a short and incendiary sentence before turning into the disco ball. Did you catch it? Neither did I, and I've been playing this game for over 30 years, but according to this interview with the International House of Mojo, the Atlantean fart monster says, and I quote, "Fuck Sierra." Thanks to Calculon1712 on my Discord for dropping this little tidbit in the SQH Discord, and now back to the video. And so the world's most famous archaeologist once again leaves a famous mythical location even more fucked up than it was when he arrived, and the game ends with or without Sophia by his side because, as I said, it is perfectly possible to just leave her ass to die in there. Omelets and eggs, honey. And yes, the end game once you reach Atlantis is the exact same no matter what path you took to get here, but the fact that you can take 3 different paths to get here, in my opinion, is just simply amazing. In fact, the whole game is amazing, and it's easily one of the best adventure games of all time. Yeah, I said it. I mean, I know I've somehow gotten this reputation of being a Sierra fanboy, probably because I arrogantly named myself after my favorite game series, which just happens to be a series made by Sierra, but the truth is, I played way more LucasArts games than Sierra games as a kid. I'm not Team Sierra all the way. In fact, I'll be the first to admit that in retrospect, LucasArts probably had the upper hand when it came to satisfying game design back in the day. But I also refuse to fall into the tired debate of which company was the best, because that's just pointless. Just because the Sierra games were harder and a bit more brutal doesn't make them any less worthy or deserving of their legacy. LucasArts games may have had more sensible puzzle design, but they also played it safe. Sierra games swung for the fences, and they weren't afraid to take risks or change up the formula, even if not all of those swings ended up being home runs. So, I have absolutely no problem saying that Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis is one of the best adventure games of all time, and if you disagree, well, what do I care? As my friend Mick would say,
that sounds like a you problem, mate.
Exactly.
But wait! There's more!
Oh hey, I nearly forgot all about the bonus round, so try to ignore the fact that I obviously wrote and recorded this bit after I'd originally recorded the first script, and let's get stuck in, because there's some fun shit hiding out in this game.
Hello.
First, let's talk alternate versions. For all my DOS homeboys, as well as the bizarre tribal culture of Macintosh users, Fate of Atlantis was released on floppy disks in 1992 and on CD-ROM a year later in 1993. There's not really any difference between the two other than the CD-ROM version having voice acting, so let's have a quick look at some versions that are radically different. First of all, we've got the Amiga version, which was released at the same time as the floppy version in 1992. The graphics have obviously taken a hit from being downgraded from the 256 color palette of the PC-DOS version to the measly 32 colors of the Amiga, but that's to be expected, and the end result actually doesn't look too bad. The same can't be said for the actual playing experience, though. If I were to say that this game plays like wading through mud barefoot with concrete blocks tied to your legs, it would be a charitable understatement. If you were an Amiga gamer in 1992, chances are you'd be playing on an Amiga 500, and woe be your fucking soul if you happen to pick this game up, because you'd have to have the patience of a fucking Zen Buddhist. It's not just that the game is slow, although it is, especially if there's more than 2 characters on screen at any time, it's the disk swapping. If you didn't install this to your hard drive, a luxury that very few people could afford in 1992, since it could easily run you almost as much as the goddamn machine itself, you'd be stuck juggling these 11 disks in the air as the game constantly moans for you to swap disks to perform even the simplest things. Like here, where Indy has to walk from the halls of Barnett College across the road to his office. You've just swapped to disk 2 to load the room, but halfway across the hall, the game asks for disk 1 just so Indy can cross the road, then asks for disk 2 again as he reaches the door. And then disk 1 once you've gone through the door. What the fuck? I counted 12 disk swaps just to get past the intro sequence with Indy arriving in New York, and then a 13th after you've taken a few steps down the road, because why not? Now, I'm told by reputable connoisseurs that the average Amiga player in 1992 would have had more than 1 floppy drive, 2 minimum actually, and that does make things considerably easier, but woe be unto ye who only had 1 floppy drive. My heart aches for you. And I'll just tell you this right now, because this befuddled the piss out of me. If you try to play this game on an emulator and you find that all the hotspots are misaligned, like here where the hotspot for the newspaper is floating about 20 or 30 pixels above where it should be, then chances are you're trying to play an NTSC version of the game on an emulator that's set to PAL mode. Without getting into the weeds too much, because as I believe I have mentioned before, I'm not Technology Connections, PAL has a higher vertical resolution than NTSC. Anyway, let's put this Amiga thing to the side and talk about an entirely different region of the world, because shit starts getting a bit peculiar when we hop on over to the FM Towns version. Now, try to ignore the double mouse cursor here. That's a quirk of the emulator I was using, and I couldn't figure out how to get rid of it, and I'll explain why at the end of the video. For now, let's just focus on the game itself. The FM Towns was a DOS-based home computer for the Japanese market with a built-in CD-ROM drive, and LucasArts games in particular seem to thrive on this system. In fact, the FM Towns version of Loom is the only version where you can get the 256 color graphics without the truncated script of the DOS CD-ROM version, but that's a whole different story. Now, since this was a Japanese system that was never sold outside of Japan, the FM Towns version of Fate of Atlantis lets you play the game in Japanese. It's the CD-ROM version of the game, so it has all the voiceovers, but they weren't dubbed into Japanese, which is a bit of a shame because I would really love to hear what a Japanese Indiana Jones sounds like, and this is the only clip I could find. Anyway, the FM Towns has all the original voices, but you can choose to play with Japanese subtitles. And I say choose because they also give you the option to play the entire game in English. It's almost as if they knew that someday some jackass on eBay would be making absolute bank selling this thing for 800 euros. Good God. Anyway, the thing I actually find the most intriguing about these two versions, Amiga and the FM Towns version, is that they have something the PC or Macintosh versions don't have: smooth scrolling. I know that's a very minor thing to single out, but I always found the jerky scrolling of LucasArts games to be especially jarring, and it's amazing to see that the backgrounds actually scroll smoothly here for a change. Now, you'd expect the Amiga to be able to do this because it has all sorts of visual hardware trickery up its sleeve that the PC could only dream of, but the FM Towns version is, as far as I know, basically the DOS version, with a Japanese translation thrown in, or, well, I suppose not. I don't know enough about the FM Towns to say. Frankly, I don't really know anything about the FM Towns at all, so maybe someone in the comments will rush to my aid and call me an idiot. Wouldn't be the first time. Anyway, let's round things off with a stuff we could have seen, but never did round. Hidden within the game's resource files are a handful of little fun bonuses, such as an alternate version of the room in the labyrinth with the Minotaur statue in it, which looks considerably less goofy than the one in the final game. No idea why they discarded this one in favor of the one we got, but In the game, Indy whips off the head of the statue onto a part of the floor that lowers like an elevator, and I'm assuming the pit in the floor in this alternate version was supposed to be that elevator, but maybe it just didn't look right. It certainly is a small elevator compared to the one in the final game, but hey. There's also a handful of unused catacomb screens, which aren't very interesting, but what really caught my eye was this unused part of Sophia's office in New York. Now, in the final game, you only see this part of the screen here, but there was a whole living area off to the right that we never got to see. And apparently, it's also possible, or at least it was at one time, to walk around in this area, since some of the objects here have look and use responses, but in the final game, this room is only used for a cutscene. Well, half the room, actually. And lastly, there's Marcus. Good old Marcus. Now, you may remember him portrayed in the movies by the expertly talented Denham Elliott, and this guy, well, he's certainly not Denham Elliott.
Indy, Kerner found you. What if he finds her? We should warn the woman.
And to this day, whenever something slightly peculiar or out of the ordinary happens, I still find myself saying, how odd. Anyway, if you can't get enough of this powerhouse performance, you will be saddened indeed when I tell you that we actually got robbed of some extra dialogue from Marcus, which was recorded by the voice actor, but ultimately taken out of the game. When Indy sets off to find Sophia in the intro, he just steps outside and immediately gets into the taxi, and it's all on autopilot. But apparently you were originally supposed to be able to go back inside your office and get chastised by this superlative thespian to get your ass off to New York.
Now is not the time. Miss Hapgood may be in real danger. Indy, please. You ought to get going.
Gotta tell you, indeed, a grave injustice to leave that on the cutting room floor. I think we can all agree. Now, okay, lastly, a few words about how to play this game today, because now I've shown you a bunch of different versions, and they all play just fine in ScumVM, which is to be expected, since that's what ScumVM was originally built for, playing LucasArts games. The name ScumVM even has the name of LucasArts' game engine right there in it, Scum, or Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion, an acronym that they for some reason decided to keep despite using the engine for pretty much all of the games up to and including Curse of Monkey Island in 1997, and VM then stands for Virtual Machine. So I could have gone the easy route and just played all the different versions in ScumVM, but I decided to go for a more authentic experience this time around. My main playthrough of the game, which was the PC-DOS version, was played using the Dream emulator, 2 M's, created by Aaron Giles, a former programmer at LucasArts who was mainly employed to do Macintosh ports of their existing library of games. Now, on the surface, Dream does the same as ScumVM does. It lets you play LucasArts games on a modern Windows PC without having to fuck around with a simulated DOS environment like DOSBox. It's basically just an easy, no-nonsense way to play the games without having to have any knowledge of how DOS works. And I say this with a ton of love for DOSBox, which is a magical utility all on its own. But DOSBox's purpose isn't to just run LucasArts games. It's a DOS emulator. It's right there in the name. So if you want to play the game in DOS and get that authentic DOS experience, then yes, DOSBox is absolutely a viable alternative. alternative, but if you've never been around a DOS machine before, it can be a bit of a daunting prospect. Anyway, the primary difference between ScumVM and Dream lies in the way the games are emulated. To put it simply, ScumVM runs the games in their own custom-built, reverse-engineered environment, kind of like a very accurate but still imperfect recreation of what the games were really like, whereas Dream runs the games in their native format. ScumVM only needs the resource files of the original games and then runs them in their own little native environment, but Dream requires you to have the original game as it was released, including the original executable. Dream is therefore technically a more accurate representation of the games, although to be fair, most players probably won't notice the differences. Likewise, the Amiga and FM Towns versions play just fine in ScumVM too, but they play on their best behavior, you might say. Playing the Amiga version in ScumVM doesn't provide you with the agonizing slowdowns nor the rage-inducing constant disk swapping of the original. And for that wholesome experience, I decided to emulate the game using FSUAE, a dedicated Amiga emulator which can be configured to emulate various different iterations of the Amiga system. And lastly, the FM Towns version was played using the Towns EMU emulator, which is why you saw those two mouse cursors earlier. I have no idea how to get rid of the Windows cursor hovering on top of the in-game cursor, but I honestly didn't bother fucking around enough with the emulator to find out. Towns EMU lets you mount an actual image of the FM Towns CD, which provided me with a more accurate emulation of how the original system would have handled things, because again, it's emulating the hardware of the actual thing rather than being a sort of reinterpretation, which is what ScumVM does. Now, I'm not saying this to be a purist or anything. Whichever way you choose to play the game is entirely up to you. You can play any version of the game in ScumVM and have a great time with it with next to zero hassle, and I'd honestly recommend doing that because it really is the simplest way of doing it. I just thought for the sake of this video, I'd add an extra layer of unnecessary self-torture to give you some idea of how this thing played back in 1992 and 1993. Anyway, that about does it. Join the SCreates Discord to hang out with nerds of unimaginable power, and please check out my Patreon. Both links are at the bottom of the video description, and people never seem to notice they're there, so I just thought I'd mention it for once. And if you like the remixes of the soundtrack in this video, there's also a link to a free download on Bandcamp down there somewhere. Alright, that's enough pathetic shilling. You probably already stopped the video, or at least fast forwarded through this bit, so take care. I'll see you around the Chrono stream. Bye!